हुआ कादियान का हर चार सू है शोहरत हुआ कादियान का मस्कन है जो के महल आखिर ज़मान का मस्कन है जो के महल आखिर ज़मान का आएंगे अब मसीह दोबारा ज़मीं पे आएंगे अब मसीह दोबारा ज़मीं पे क्यों नज़ारा बा गया है उन्हें आसमान का नज़ारा बा गया है उन्हें आसमान का तुम उम्मते मुहम्मद खैरुल रसूल से हो तुम उम्मते मुहम्मद खैरुल रसूल से हो तुम उसी मेहरबान का है लुत्फ़ व फ़ज़्ल तुम पे उसी मेहरबान का.
In the history of world religions, divine prophecies and their fulfillment have stood as some of the greatest signs in the favor of truthfulness of God's messengers. And the fulfillment of such divine prophecies proves to the world that the man who stands before them claiming to be from God himself has indeed been appointed and commissioned by him. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah and welcome to Ahmadiyyat, Roots to Branches. In today's episode, join us as we take a look at some of the main events of the year 1905 in the life of the promised Messiah alayhi salatu wasalam. It was in this very year that a devastating earthquake shook the northern hemisphere of India and wreaked havoc and destroyed entire villages and towns. Now, what's interesting is that the promised Messiah ﷺ actually foretold the occurrence of such a calamity, and thus the Jamaat was safeguarded from it. Now, although the promised Messiah ﷺ himself and Jamaat were safeguarded from calamities such as the plague and earthquakes, death is something inevitable and cannot be avoided by mankind at all. And so we will learn about the demise and the passing away of two beloved companions of the promised Messiah ﷺ, about which some have stated that this very year, 1905, in which they passed away, can rightly be deemed a year of grief. Now, this very year is also a year in which the promised Messiah ﷺ received some revelations regarding his own demise. And so we will take a look at those revelations and the writing of his book, Al-Wasiyat, the Will. And finally, along with these events, we will take a look at the establishments of Madrasa Ahmadiyya, later on known as Jamia Ahmadiyya, Bahishti Maqbara, the Heavenly Graveyard, and Sadr Anjuman Ahmadiyya, which was a committee established by the promised Messiah ﷺ in order to further organize the work that was being carried out by Jamaat. So with this, let us take a look at 1905's devastating earthquake, which was foretold and prophesied by the promised Messiah ﷺ.
By the end of the year 1903, the promised Messiah ﷺ began receiving countless revelations regarding a very strong earthquake which was soon to come. The promised Messiah ﷺ was also told that all those who were righteous and God-fearing would be saved from the ill effects of this earthquake, as well as the house of the promised Messiah ﷺ and all those who believed in him. Hence, on April 4th, 1905, in the city of Kangra, a very strong earthquake hit, and it was so strong that anything on that land was destroyed, including temples which had been standing for over 2,000 years. Now, there are two very interesting incidents which are associated with this earthquake. The first is regarding a man named Pandit Mola Ram, who was a Hindu clerk and wrote letters back and forth with the promised Messiah ﷺ. Now, the day before the earthquake hit, he received a letter in which the promised Messiah ﷺ informed him of the coming of an earthquake. However, he did not open the letter that night and waited until the next morning to open the letter. Now, when he read that there was an earthquake coming, he immediately left his house, and as a result, was saved from any ill effects of the earthquake. The second incident is regarding the promised Messiah ﷺ himself. On the morning of the earthquake, April 4th, 1905, he was writing the 5th volume of his book, Brahine Ahmadiyya. And as he was writing, he came to a revelation which he had received from God. And this was that God sent a warner to the world, but the world did not accept him. However, God will accept him, and he will manifest many strong signs to prove his truthfulness. Now, just as the promised Messiah ﷺ had written this, the earthquake hit. The next day, the promised Messiah ﷺ wrote a leaflet in which he called all people to take heed to these signs which had manifested and to join him and his Jamaat.
On the 5th of April, 1905, the promised Messiah ﷺ released an announcement called Ad-Dawat. The primary message of Ad-Dawat was to call people towards the religion of Islam and to warn of the coming earthquake. The promised Messiah ﷺ wrote, "Show modesty, O dear ones, for the days of your Lord have come. The heavens shall show such wonders that even your forefathers could not foretell. Blessed is he who does not fall back from my message." When the days of the earthquake came near and there were small triggers in the earth, the people would run towards the promised Messiah ﷺ and would literally cling onto his clothes for protection. The promised Messiah ﷺ took many of his close companions to his garden, where he had created some temporary residences. He and his companions stayed in those temporary residences for 3 months under the divine protection of Allah the Almighty. On the 30th of June, 1905, the promised Messiah ﷺ then returned to Qadian with his companions. When the media heard of the message of the promised Messiah ﷺ, they took his message for wrong and literally asked the government to boycott any further claims that the promised Messiah ﷺ would want to bring into public. The promised Messiah ﷺ responded that, "Why do you take my pure intentions and glad tidings for ill? I am only here to speak the truth. Only God can judge the actions of all."
In April 1904, when the promised Messiah ﷺ was working on the 5th part of his famous book, Brahine Ahmadiyya, he also mentioned a poem which talks about a promised earthquake. He further writes in the footnote that he himself did not even know the meaning of that earthquake, and it could be possible that that earthquake could be a metaphorical meaning for a much bigger and greater event. So all the wrongdoers should repent, since this is the only way for them to be safe. The poem talks about all the events that have occurred in World War I. But the amazing thing is that the World War was supposed to happen during the lifetime of the promised Messiah ﷺ. So upon this, he prayed to God so he may postpone this event, and God accepted his prayers. This shows the great love God had for the promised Messiah ﷺ.
Hazrat Maulvi Abdul Kareem Sialkot Raziyallahu Ta'ala Anhu was one of the great companions of the promised Messiah ﷺ, and he rendered great services for the Jamaat. He was known to have a very strong and very powerful voice, and whenever he would speak, anyone who would listen would be completely immersed in the words which he was saying. He was also known to have a very beautiful and melodious voice, and whoever listened to this voice, their hearts would be moved. Now, Hazrat Maulvi Abdul Kareem Sialkot Raziyallahu Ta'ala Anhu can be most noted for his immense love of the promised Messiah ﷺ. In the last few days of his life, he had fallen ill, and during these days he would often cry. And he wouldn't cry because of the pain he felt because of the sickness. Rather, he cried because it had been so long since he had seen the face of the promised Messiah ﷺ. Now similarly, when the promised Messiah ﷺ was approached to go visit Hazrat Maulana Sahib, he replied, "Of course I would love to go visit him. However, I cannot bear to see him in such a state." Now, as I mentioned, Hazrat Maulvi Abdul Kareem Sialkoti had fallen ill, and the name of the disease which he had fallen ill to was carbuncle. And it was due to this disease and various other ailments that on April 10th, 1905, Hazrat Maulvi Abdul Kareem Sialkoti Raziyallahu Ta'ala Anhu passed away. And another notable fact here is that Hazrat Maulvi Abdul Kareem Sialkoti Raziyallahu Ta'ala Anhu was the very first person to be buried in Bahishti Maqbara, Qadian.
Allah the Almighty revealed to the promised Messiah ﷺ that two pillars were about to break. After the sad demise of Hazrat Maulvi Abdul Kareem Sahib Sialkoti radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, the community was saddened to hear of the demise of Hazrat Burhanuddin Jailmi Sahib radiyallahu ta'ala anhu on the 3rd of December 1905. The promised Messiah ﷺ realized that the breaking of these two pillars meant the passing away of these two great scholars. Hazrat Burhanuddin Jailmi Sahib radiyallahu ta'ala anhu first met the promised Messiah ﷺ in Hoshiarpur, and after he joined the community, he would come and visit the promised Messiah ﷺ every single year. Whenever he would visit the promised Messiah ﷺ, the promised Messiah ﷺ would say that I feel great calm and peace whenever Maulvi Sahib is near me. Hazrat Jailmi Sahib radiyallahu ta'ala anhu was a great scholar of Sufi merit and would always spend his time in the study of Jamaat.
After the demise of these two beloved and scholarly companions of the promised Messiah ﷺ, it seemed as if there was a void in Jamaat. And this was because there was no one, or there were very few people who could replace such scholars and the wisdom and knowledge that they contributed to the Jamaat. Now the promised Messiah ﷺ, sensing the presence of such a void, resolved to create an organization or an institution which would guarantee that scholars of the Jamaat would continue to be trained and produced in order to propagate the message of Ahmadiyyat. So in the Jalsa Sana of that year, in December of 1905, the promised Messiah ﷺ made a very emotional and heartfelt speech regarding the demise of his two beloved companions. And he expressed his thoughts about the fact that he could not see anybody who could replace the scholars of the Jamaat who were passing away. And so he stated that the Madrasa Talim al-Islam, which was already established, should prepare students in order to propagate the message of Islam, Ahmadiyyat. Now, after listening to this speech, people realized that this was indeed a grave concern for Jamaat, and the very future of Jamaat would rely on what they would do next. So after consulting his companions, the promised Messiah ﷺ agreed to a proposal which stated that a branch of religious education should be incorporated in the already existing Madrasa Talim al-Islam, and over here students would be trained and prepared in religious studies in order to become scholars of the faith. And so this was incorporated the very next month in January of 1906, and later on this became its own institution known as Jamia Ahmadiyya. And today, by the grace of Allah the Almighty, Jamia Ahmadiyya has been established in various parts of the world, such as Pakistan, Ghana, Bangladesh, Canada, the UK, and Germany. And this institution continues to produce scholars of the faith who have dedicated their entire lives for the service of Ahmadiyyat, the true Islam.
The wife of the promised Messiah ﷺ, Hazrat Amma Jan, had the desire of going back to Delhi where she originally came from. And since her brother, Dr. Mir Muhammad Ismail, had started working there at a hospital, her desire grew. So the promised Messiah ﷺ prayed for 40 days, and he was told to join them on this journey. So he decided to join them on his journey, and he also took a few of his companions with him. So they all departed on the 22nd October 1905. But before their departure, the promised Messiah ﷺ had a vision. And in that vision he saw that the gates of Delhi were closed. And a man came and placed something harmful inside the ear of the promised Messiah ﷺ. And when he asked the man for the reason of his action, the man replied that the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, has experienced much worse. The promised Messiah ﷺ explained the meaning of this vision by saying that just like the gates of Delhi were closed, so will be the hearts of the people who live in Delhi. During the journey towards Delhi, the promised Messiah ﷺ and his companions also visited the graves of the previous Islamic scholars. On the way back to Qadian, the promised Messiah ﷺ and his companions stopped at Amritsar. Many Jamaat members came to meet the promised Messiah ﷺ. In Amritsar, the promised Messiah ﷺ decided to deliver a speech in which he said that 14 years ago when he was here, he had very few followers, and now there are a lot of people who accepted Ahmadiyyat. One member of the Jamaat thought that the promised Messiah ﷺ is exhausted and thirsty, so he decided to offer him a cup of tea. The promised Messiah ﷺ rejected it since it was the month of Ramzan. But according to the Quran, it was not mandatory upon him to fast since he was sick and he was traveling. But since the man kept on offering him the cup of tea, the promised Messiah ﷺ finally decided to accept the cup of tea. Upon this, the non-Ahmadi Muslims started mocking the promised Messiah ﷺ. He decided to leave, and he was being protected in a horse carriage. The opponents started throwing stones at him, and after all this was done, the promised Messiah ﷺ said that it was necessary for this sunnah to be fulfilled. And all this was referring to that one vision the promised Messiah ﷺ had from the beginning of this journey.
In the year 1905, the promised Messiah ﷺ began receiving revelations regarding his demise. In one revelation, he saw that a bowl of water was presented to him, and there were only 2 or 3 sips left of water. This symbolized the time he had left on this earth. In another revelation, the promised Messiah ﷺ was told that he only had a few days left on the earth, and that the day would soon come where sadness would be cast over all the people. In light of receiving this news, the promised Messiah ﷺ published a booklet entitled Al-Wasiyat, or the Will. In this booklet, he advised his Jama'at to bring up a reform within themselves. However, the main message of this booklet was that of Khilafat. The promised Messiah ﷺ said that there would be a successorship after his demise. He explained that the death of a prophet or a messenger of God comes at a time where it seems most inopportune, and it gives a chance to the opposers and the disbelievers to mock and jest and say that now the mission has come to an end. Then the promised Messiah ﷺ went on further to explain that God shows his power in 2 ways. The first is during the life of a prophet, and the second is after his demise, when there is unrest and people are scrambling and trying to find answers, and there are people mocking and jesting at the fact that the prophet has died. It is during this time that God raises from among the people a person who will carry on the mission of the prophet. This is the person referred to as a Khalifa.
Under divine guidance, the promised Messiah ﷺ established a graveyard named Behishti Maqbara. It is for those people who dedicated their lives for a good cause, who spend their lives in the fear of God, and who spend their wealth in His cause. The promised Messiah ﷺ has stated 3 conditions for burial in Behishti Maqbara in his book, The Will. Those 3 conditions are as follows. Number 1, whoever desires to be buried in this graveyard should contribute towards the expenses of its maintenance according to his capacity. Number 2, they should make an oath that 1/10 of his property shall, under direction of the movement, be devoted to the propagation of Islam and carrying out the teachings of the Quran. It will be open to every righteous person whose faith is perfect to provide for this purpose in his will more than 1/10, but it shall not be less. Number 3, they shall lead a righteous life and abstain from all that is prohibited, and shall not do anything that amounts to associating of something with God, or to innovation in the faith. They should be a true and sincere Muslim.
In order to take care of all the matters regarding the Behishti Maqbara, the promised Messiah ﷺ, under divine guidance of Allah the Almighty, made Majlis Karpardaz Masale Kabristan. The main purpose of this committee was to take care of all the administrative and financial matters of the Behishti Maqbara. After this committee was set into place, a suggestion was made that another organization should also be made that will plan and organize all the departments of Jamaat Ahmadiyya. The promised Messiah ﷺ graciously accepted this. The rules were set into place, and Sadr Anjuman Ahmadiyya was first announced in 1906 in the newspapers of Al-Hakam and Al-Badr.
So in conclusion, the purpose of today's episode was to show our viewers some of the main events of the year 1905 in the life of the promised Messiah ﷺ. Divine prophecies were fulfilled in order to prove to the world that the promised Messiah ﷺ was indeed appointed and commissioned by God Almighty Himself. Now, just as the promised Messiah ﷺ worked tirelessly in order to propagate the true teachings of Islam to the world, he worked equally as hard in order to establish a community which was organized, dynamic, and productive. And even as the very year of his demise approached and became near, he never for a single moment ceased to stop his mission, which was to propagate the teachings of Ahmadiyyat, the true Islam. So with this, Jazakallah for joining us on Ahmadiyyat Rooster Branches. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
चारों तरफ है शोर बपा अल अमान शोरा हुआ